the Italian sites, in fact, the partner is the TESAF department of the University of Padova. This is a department of forest science. And we had some help in the selection of the sites from Gala Alto Bellunese, which is our observer partner, and some activist groups that pointed out some places that needed intervention and help. Obviously, we are not that obviously, but we are in Dolomites, as you can see here from the color of these Dolomite rocks. And in fact, the area of our project was the Cadore area, meaning the northernmost point of the Veneto region. So we are in between Austria, Friuli, Venezia Giulia, and Alto Adige, Südtirol regions and countries, obviously. This is the Veneto region, so it's the region of Venice, and this upper part is called Cadore. We selected 6 sites. There are 2 here and 2 here very close, so the distribution was a bit uneven, but at the same time, we were able to include all the different, let's say, most important valleys of the area, so that there is also a bit of visibility for this project. Most of the sites are property of municipalities, but 2 are property of associations of traditional landowners, let's say commons that still exist in the area. So we can delve directly in one of the sites and start from the ponds in Costa della Spina in the municipality of Comelico Superiore. This is quite a strange environment because it is a long ridge that is filled with over 40 ponds. Most of them were originated as craters from bombings during the First World War. So if we watch here is the Spina, and on this side there was the Austrian front, and here was the Italian front. So the site was bombed, and many of the sites are in fact of a peculiar form, peculiar shape, and are of war origin. The site is property of the Regole di Dosoledo, and this is both part of a special area of conservation and a special protection area. So it's a Natura 2000 site, and it's used as a pasture. So what will we do regarding the monitoring? The area is very big, even if the ponds are scattered only along, let's say, 1.5 kilometers. So it's quite big anyway. And we decided to focus on vegetation, since we understood that vegetation on the pond banks was almost identical in all the ponds. We decided to have 2 plots, one at the beginning, one at the end of the ridge. We thoroughly studied dragonflies and amphibians along, let's say, almost all the ponds. And for butterflies, we established a transect that is written in yellow here to survey them. And what we found was that vegetation around the ponds is quite interesting. In fact, there is a mosaic of alpine heath, siliceous grassland, and siliceous scree. So they are all protected habitat types in the Natura 2000 network, obviously. At the same time, the banks of the ponds showed very poor vegetation, very degraded vegetation, mostly with Carex nigra sedges and the Champlex cespitosa, which can become an invasive plant in some of these habitats, even if it's a local plant, let's say. And the main problem is obviously drawn by the presence of cattle and horses on the ridge. And in fact, you can see here from the photo that most of the banks are well trampled upon. And obviously there are some problems about eutrophication. So regarding vegetation, we didn't find anything very special along the banks of the ponds and inside the ponds. Nonetheless, we found a community of butterflies that is made of at least 11 species. This can seem not too much, but we are at 2,000-meter high, so 2,000 meters on the sea level. There are some, among them, there are some wetland adapted species, such as Cenonympha gardetta, which is here, for example, Erebia epiphrone, but probably the most interesting result was that we found this Coleus palaeno, which is not a protected species, but at the same time it's quite rare on the Dolomites and in Veneto region. And we confirmed the presence of this species in the area. For dragonflies, we found 6 species. Again, this can seem not too much, but we are at high elevation. Most of them were not previously recorded in the area, and we found 2 species that are of conservation interest for Italy, at least for Veneto region and Dolomites. One is Cenagrium astulatum, is this species. Here you see the male and the female in, let's say, at the end of mating behavior, and Cordulia enea. At the same time, we observed that the presence of dragonflies is quite well high. In fact, they were present on 21 ponds, in which we observed 11 ponds with mating behavior or reproductive behavior or larvae or etc. Maybe even juveniles emerging. So the area is quite interesting as a let's say spawning site, let's say breeding site for dragonflies, even if there are no species of community interest. Regarding amphibians, I'm going to say it now, and then I'm not sure I'm going to repeating it on the next slides, because the situation is almost all the same. When you go up in elevation, the community tends to be limited to bufo, the common toad, the Ictiosaura alpestris, the alpine newt, and the Rana temporaria, who is the common frog. Anyway, we observed that they were present in 31 out of 40 ponds, and for the newts, and 15 ponds for the toads. And in many of them, we observed the larvae or eggs or juveniles and so on. The Rana temporaria was spotted only once, so probably it's at the upper side of its habitat. Yes, that could be also, could seem not very interesting from the point of view of amphibians, but in fact, in many areas of Cadore, the population even of common species such as Ictiosaura alpestris are in contraction because of the loss of habitat, breeding habitats. And so when we find like 31 ponds with alpine newt, this seems to for us to be something worth protecting. From the point of view of conservation, the site is quite difficult to access, in fact, and we limited ourselves to fencing some ponds across the area with electric fences. So we fenced four ponds, and the maintenance was done by us with the help of personnel from the Regola. And the idea was that we at least try to provide some let's say, protected sites for the dragonflies, especially in the emergence phase, and to reduce trampling and eutrophication. What we would suggest is that this fencing continues in the next years, but also that some periodic mowing of at least parts of the banks should be done in order to provide some more, let's say, diversified vegetation, even if, as I said, the vegetation here is quite poor and we are at very high altitude. Then we can pass to the Poljet bog remnant. In fact, Poljet is a quite big, let's say, peatland wet meadow site in the municipality of Lozzo di Cadore, but most of it has been drained, so the peatland part has become usually wet meadow. It's also used as a pasture, and on the eastern side, let's say, of this area, there is a well preserved bog remnant. And also we think that this is interesting because this peatland is on a plateau which is very rich of wetlands. So this is the same photo I showed you before for bogs. In fact, we have hammocks of bog mosses with Eriophorum growing on it. The area is quite big, but we focus for the conservation only on this part, so that we comply to the idea of having small intervention, even because the let's say a huge project in this area would be too much for the duration of the project. We established 2 vegetation plots and a butterfly transect. And in fact, the vegetation had some quite interesting results, because we found a quite well preserved bog vegetation with Sphanium mosses, with some rare species such as the Rosera rotundifolia, which is an interesting carnivorous species, and for example also Carex pauciflora, which is quite rare in Veneto region and Italy, and other species of interest could be, for example, Calluna vulgaris and many other species of sedges. At the same time, the bog is characterized also by the presence of ditches that are usually occupied by Carex rostrata, Miniante stifoliata, and Juncus effusus. The main two problems here are actually derived from the presence of drainage ditches, but also from the presence, frequentation by horse and cattle trampling. So what we proposed to do was to fence some particularly sensible areas and damming these ditches, at least two. In these, here you see one, but there are some others that are far more deep. And the fact is that we were able to fence the sites and prevent, for example, horses to get into them and destroy the hummocks and hollow structures of bog mosses. But at the same time, the damming of the ditches was not feasible in the 2023 season because of authorization, let's say, there was not enough time to reach the authorization before the winter season, and since we are at 1,800 meters of elevation, you can understand that it's difficult to intervene on the sites when there is no okay. So what we propose as a further management, and we will try to implement with the help of volunteers in the next seasons, is damming these ditches with wooden dams, and also we would like to propose periodic mowing of some areas of the peatland, especially in the let's say western part, so that we can have a better situation for vegetation in general, and also probably the creation of some small ponds for amphibians. Then just like 1 kilometer far from Polget, there is this Laghetto delle Sepolture, which is property of the same municipality of Lozzo di Cadore, such as the Polget peatland. This is a temporary pond. It didn't used to be temporary. In fact, it is temporary since a few years. That is surrounded by a wet meadow that is included in a pasture that is used for cattle. And we can say the same thing about Polget. It's in an area that is very rich in wetlands. So, and at the same time, if we watch on the, if you look at the map, we can see that yes, there are some different wetland sites in the area. At the same time, this Laghetto delle Sepolture, just a pond, like a shallow lake, is the last remnant of aquatic environment in the entire plateau. There once were just like 5 or 6 other ponds. One was here, for example. One was a bit southern here. One was a bit on the north here. So this is the only remaining small lake in a big area, including most of the Marmarole group of mountains. And so this site was actually followed for 3 years, and this is our 3rd year of protecting it. We included it in the site so that we in the project so that we could still help it recover. We studied butterflies on this transect. We studied vegetation on some plots. We had point surveys for dragonflies and amphibians. And we already knew the sites. In fact, this is the typical vegetation that you would expect at a high altitude pond in a pasture. Let's say there is a sedge bed, mostly made of Carex nigra, Carex echinata, and other sedges. The wet meadow is mostly occupied by different species of grasses and sedges, for example, Carex eporina, Carex pallescens, some rushes such as Juncus effusus. But there are some signs, especially outside the area that we have managed for 2 years, of trampling and eutrophication. And it is mainly due to the presence of the species, the Champis espitosa, and for example, other indicators such as Po alpina, the subspecies vivipara. On the other side, the aquatic habitat is recovering if we compare to the last years, and is now almost completely occupied by a stand, a monospecific stand of Heliocaris palustris. So it's again in the sedge species, but there are some traces, some indication of desiccation that we already knew was happening, but this is visible also in the vegetation, for example, for the presence of Glyceria notata and Alopecourus equalis. I'm not showing you all the groups, but for example, for butterflies in this transect, we saw 18 species. Probably the most interesting species that we saw this year was Boloria tore. This species that is quite rare in the area, and also it's a wetland species, let's say, along with, for example, Cynonympha gardeta and the Rebia ephiphron that I mentioned before. Last year, we also spotted the protected species Sphengaris arion, and we have some news that someone has spotted the Euphideria saurinia in the same area. And the fact is that the community of butterflies is quite mixed because this is a mosaic of different environments, from screes to trees to wet meadows to ponds, etc., peatlands. And so obviously the community is quite diverse, diversified. But yes, there are still some interesting presences that should be of interest, let's say. We found 5 species of dragonflies, and again, this can see quite a few, but this is a very, very small pond, let's say 20 meters by 5. You found 5 species. This year, there were other 2 that were spotted in the last years. But for example, maybe the most interesting for this year is that now the ponds has Chenagrium astulatum, and when we compare to the last year's community, this is a good event. Chenagrium astulatum is quite more sensitive than other species, and so its appearance means that the situation is going on well. At the same time, obviously, the most frequent species were, for example, Esna iunce, which is the most common species in Cadore, and Libellula quadrimaculata, that is also a very common species. For conservation, here we try to, let's say, implement some of the activities that we already did last years with some improvement, obviously. The pond and the wet meadow were fenced with an electrical fence at the beginning of the season, so that the area out inside the fence, so the wet meadow and the pond were protected from cattle trampling, but also, for example, from boars. And so this area was fenced for all the season. Then at the end of the season, with the help of some volunteers, we mowed a very big area of pasture. And this is done to, let's say, create somewhat of a natural disturbance regime for this area without the presence of cattle and the introduction of feces from cattle, for example. But at the same time, when we cut, we just try and put all the species, all the vegetation species at the same level, so that the dominant species have reduced their advantage, let's say. Also, we removed some parts of the sedges banks in order to slow the process of overgrowth by the sedges on the small lake. And also we had some intervention on the desiccation-related species. The site was already protected from 2021, and we suggest that these activities should be maintained, at least mowing every 2 years. Then we can skip to Laghetto di Vedorcia, is among the last sites. And Laghetto di Vedorcia is a very, very small site. We were interested in that because it's very isolated from other wetland areas, and also because it's in the area of alpine huts, so it's quite frequented by tourists, and we wanted to be able to communicate with them to show that some of these habitats should be protected and so on. This is a very small, a very poor, high altitude pond with sedge banks mainly made of Carex nigra. It's inside of the pasture, so usually cattle have access to this site. But what we decided to do was to fence the area, in fact, and to study the vegetation and the amphibians and dragonflies that were present in the area. The vegetation was really poor, I have to say, mostly composed only of Carex nigra. At the same time, we found something interesting on the side of dragonflies because we spotted 4 species, which is quite a lot for an isolated and small site. And for example, here we have again Cenagra astulatum, but we also found, for example, Esna chanea, Esna juncea, Libellula depressa. And the same could be said for the amphibians. We have the 2 common species, common toad and alpine newt, but with some, let's say, thriving populations. So the site is quite interesting, even if the potential is somewhat limited. So what we decided to do is that we fenced the pond, in fact, again with an electrified fence. We wanted to have a more intensive intervention on the stability of the water level by building a small dam here, but for authorization reasons, this was not possible in 2023. And so again, we tried to convince the municipality to do it again in the following seasons, let's say. And then to finish, I'd like to present you maybe 2 of our most important sites, but that are found in the same municipality and they are also similar to one another, which is the San Vito di Cadore sites. These are particularly dear to us because it's the same municipality of our center in Cadore. In fact, there are 2 sites. One is the Resurgence Springs, sorry for spiring, but Resurgence Springs near Lake Mosigo, here on the left, and also the La Zoppa wetland. Okay, here they seem just like a bit of ponds, but in the fact these habitats both have ponds and wet meadows. And the wet meadows, especially on the side of La Zoppa, is very interesting because it can be included in the protected habitat type 6430, that is the tall herb fringe, let's say. And so these habitats are quite similar, and also they're very close to one another. They're on the valley floor at around 1,000 meters of elevation. And what we did was that we studied vegetation in both areas. So this area is northern, it should be up here, let's say. Vegetation in both areas. And we studied amphibians, we studied butterflies, here with a transect, here with, let's say, random surveys. We also studied dragonflies to be fair, but we don't understand why, but this area of the lake is quite known for hosting a lot of species of dragonflies, and this year we spotted very few, and we have a suspect that this has something to do with the maintenance of the fish population in the lake. So to say just a few words about this, in fact, you can see that these are on the valley floor. The town is very near. There are some pastures that are now being occupied by new road constructions, and the area is quite interesting because it has the last remnants of let's say prairie habitats in the valley floor, which was otherwise occupied by either houses or trees. And what we spotted is that the vegetation was very interesting because it can be ascribed to the tall herb fringe, either with Petacites hybridus, sorry, there is an I here, and in some other areas with Filipendula ulmaria, which is this very tall grass species, let's say. The main risk is given by the overgrowth of bushes and trees encircling the areas. In fact, there was also another interesting, let's say, result, which is in the butterfly communities. On both species, we found about, let's say, 20 species each, with some species of conservation interest for Veneto region, but especially this one, even if it's not a wetland species, Lopinga kine, nonetheless, it's a very well protected species in the Annex 4 of Habitats Directive. And so we thought that we needed to avoid the prairie loss. These species are not particularly linked to wetlands. Usually they they stay in the borders, the edges between wooded habitats and prairies, but they were quite common in the area. So we decided to try and maintain. Oh, sorry, here I don't have the images. We tried to maintain the habitat with mowing at the end of the season. That was done both in these areas and in this area, only on a part of the habitat. Obviously, the mowing was done at the end of the season in order to avoid any damage that was possible to these very well protected species. The species usually winters as larvae underneath the vegetation, so we waited for the first, let's say, very cold temperatures, and when then we lightweight equipment with the help of volunteers. And so I guess that's it on the conservation part. The only thing I wanted to tell you is that we also worked a lot on dissemination. For example, we prepared a lot of seminars, for example, one for teachers, one for forest scientists, and one again is being organized for next week, dedicated to the Italian stakeholders. And also we really did our best to work with schools. We prepared a seminar for the teachers. As I said, we prepared the booklet together with the other partners, and we involved more than 30 schools and more than 550 kids in our activities. So each class was given a lecture of 2 hours, let's say 1 hour and a half, and then some workshops. For example, here you see both the teachers and the kids making our pond food web. And I guess this is it. The only thing I want to say is that again, next week we're holding this seminar and webinar in Italian on the 23rd. And if you're willing to participate, please do so. Thank you so much.